This is why I describe, 12-step organizations and similar organizations as the closest thing public health has to a free lunch, because of their ability to provide this free, flexible access to ongoing support structures that are these entities that can sustain remission over time, and this is what we need.
Food Addiction is a podcast which explores the disease of food addiction and presents the solution. We interview professionals and counselors who specialize in the disease of food addiction, and we interview individuals who have successfully recovered from food addiction and discuss how they did it. Esther Helga Goodman-Stotier was motivated to change careers after she recovered from food addiction by opening a food addiction treatment center and the InFact School, the world's first and only sugar and food addiction counseling training, which offers a recognized certification. Check out the website for more information on obtaining this certification, as well as proven recovery programs at infactschool.com. Listen to these episodes as we discuss the problem and the solution around food addiction. This is the podcast, Food Addiction, the Problem and the Solution. I'm Susan Branscombe. I am a recovered food addict. Today on the podcast, we're excited to welcome Dr. John Kelly from Harvard, who has done some studies and has some very interesting ideas and work success about the effectiveness of 12-step programs. So I'm looking forward to talking to him. Welcome, Dr. Kelly.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I'm going to introduce you by your bio, and then we'll get into some good questions for you, which will help our listeners understand your work and the importance of it in recovery. Dr. John Kelly is the Elizabeth R. Spallin Professor of Psychiatry and Addiction Medicine at Harvard Medical School, the first endowed professor in addiction medicine at Harvard. He is also the founder and director of the Recovery Research Institute at the Massachusetts General Hospital, the associate director of the Center for Addiction Medicine at Massachusetts General, and the program director of the Addiction Recovery Management Service. Dr. Kelly is the former president of the American Psychological Association's APA, Society of Addiction Psychology, and is a fellow of the APA and a diplomate of the American Board of Professional Psychology. He has served as a consultant to U.S. federal agencies and non-federal agencies, as well as foreign governments and the United Nations. Dr. John Kelly has published over 200 peer-reviewed articles, reviews, chapters, and books in the field of addiction medicine, and was an author on the U.S. Surgeon General's report on alcohol, drugs, and health. His clinical and research work has focused on addiction treatment and the recovery process, mechanisms of behavior change, and reducing the stigma and discrimination among individuals suffering from addiction. So welcome again, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah.
Good to be here with you.
Yeah, it's great. We're going to put this in our show notes. You have a great website, www.recoveryanswers.org, and there's some great things in there. So I'm going to set you up for your work and talk to you about the study. We know that Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step recovery program for alcohol addiction, has been in existence for almost 90 years, and you did a study which was published in March of 2020, which studied the effectiveness of AA and 12-step programs. And your study was reviewed by the Cochrane organization. And for the listeners, Cochrane is the gold standard in blessing healthcare studies. It is a nonprofit, independent organization formed in 1993, and they ensure the treatment used includes the best knowledge and is independently assessed and quality checked. Their work is internationally recognized as the benchmark for high-quality information about the effectiveness of healthcare. Their mission is to provide accessible, credible information to support informed decision-making. And we're going to talk about your work. And you say in one of the papers I read, participation in the 12-step mutual help organizations such as Alcoholics Anonymous has proven to be an effective means of helping individuals with alcohol dependence achieve lasting sobriety. So yeah, your study said that AA, 12-step recovery, works, and so the answer is yes. So talk about the study and talk about Cochrane.
Yeah, so, the Cochrane, as you allude to, the Cochrane system is a kind of rigorous review framework. So what we wanted to do in this particular review study was to examine all of the literature, published literature in science on Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step treatments. These are treatments, clinical treatments, that link patients with severe alcohol use disorder or alcohol addiction to AA. And we included studies in this review that were comparative studies. So they had to have a comparison condition. They had to be prospective, longitudinal. They had to be randomized, or otherwise, if they were not randomized, they had to have an active control condition and were followed up over time. So it was a very rigorous review, as you described, Susan, in your introduction of the Cochrane Library system. It is considered to be the gold standard because it subjects current evidence, to the highest degree of scientific standard. And we wanted to do that here as well because there's lots of confusion that's remained around AA and its efficacy and 12-step treatments which link patients to AA. So we wanted to help clarify that. We found some very interesting results. I think that, which I think surprised a lot of people, was that clinical linkages to AA for people with severe alcohol problems resulted in as good outcomes on every single outcome when compared to active treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy or motivational enhancement therapy. It produced as good outcomes on every dimension except abstinence and remission, where 12-step and AA did much better. So 20 to 60% higher remission rates across 3 years compared to patients assigned to other kinds of treatments. So this is really good news. Not only that, did we find higher remission rates, but we also found reduced healthcare costs. So the linkage to AA meant that people were staying sober, not ending up in the emergency room, not ending up in overnight stays in the hospital, which is expensive medical care operations. That reduced the healthcare burden about $10 to $15 billion annually.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
That's good news.
You had, it says 27 relevant studies within the study, 10,500 participants. It's a big sample size. I know there was a report done prior to yours, but yours was much more comprehensive, right?
It was larger because there's been a lot more research been done in the last 15 years than there was in a prior review. So we were able to update and expand the review to include all the latest more rigorous and larger research trials that are being done. So that helped to clarify, I think, the picture scientifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What was your hope when you did the study? What was your goal? It was independent, it was sanctioned by Cochrane, but what was your personal hope and the people you worked with on it around the medical community clinicians that would view your study?
Well, I think the hope was to really clarify the picture, to understand more from a scientific perspective exactly what the effects were, clinical public health effects of these free resources. Because if they do work, then the public should know that they do work, they do help, because there was so much misleading information put out by various individuals in the press that as scientists we knew weren't true, but we knew lots of studies disproved a lot of those assertions made by certain people. We needed to clarify that for the clinical and public health community. So that's why we put it together and decided to review it from the most rigorous standpoint.
Yeah. The publication came out in March of 2020, and that was when the COVID pandemic was beginning. Did that affect any outcomes of having it out there to the medical community?
Outcomes in terms of?
Embracing it, because we were going through the pandemic, and your study was published at the time the pandemic was starting.
Yeah. No, I don't know. It's hard to know, isn't it? Whether that dampened the dissemination of the findings. It was featured very widely. In fact, it's one of the most widely disseminated research findings in the last 5 years, according to certain metrics out there that measures these things. So it did seem to get around the world in terms of dissemination, Susan. Of course, you don't know whether it would have gotten there quicker or gotten that information would have been disseminated more quickly were it not for COVID. That's unclear. But certainly, people are aware of these findings, and I know in the United Kingdom, for example, they have they recorded, they have documented as supporting literature for their recommendations for including participation in groups like AA in their clinical best clinical practice guidelines.
Good. Well, I am a recovered alcoholic. I used a 12-step program to help me recover, and so I know from personal experience that it works. Sample size of 1. In June 1st, I'll be sober for 12 years, and I'm sober and abstinent from food as well. I've released 70 pounds and used a 12-step recovery program in food addiction. So one thing I've noticed is when I go into my doctor and he asked how I stopped drinking or how I stopped eating, I tell him that I use a 12-step program, and to a physician, their eyes glaze over, and it's like they really still don't understand, I think, how 12-step recovery programs work. They want to throw pills at it. If I have diabetes and high blood pressure, which I have, he gave me pills for it, So we know that the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous is effective, successful, and free. It's a mutual help group, as you say, and it's done by meetings, sponsoring, and not being alone, the fellowship. So what would you say about the medical community embracing the fact that 12-step recovery works?
Yeah, I think it is in some ways, isn't it? It's a kind of a mystery, given the medical community and the medical model really treats acute diseases for the most part, acute diseases in hospitals, and then discharges people, and it's about acute medical management typically, or performing procedures that can save lives. Of course, very important. So when we think about kind of so-called behavioral health conditions, as these are commonly known, they're not trained to deal with these kind of phenomena, and this is why historically the outside of acute care detoxification and stabilization, most of the treatment has been supplied by behavioral health systems, mental health and addiction treatment systems outside of the medical kind of more formal medical community. And we do as chronic illnesses, which are behaviorally, psychologically and environmentally very responsive, the fact that they are susceptible to relapse over time means that we need some kind of ongoing recovery management or recovery monitoring models. And groups like AA and other 12-step groups and other mutual help groups are ideal for this kind of phenomena because they help people to sustain these changes week by week, month by month, over time in the communities in which they live and work. So that's the good news from a public health standpoint, is that they're a good match. And of course, the reason why they're a good match is because they were originated by people who suffered from these disorders to begin with. So they developed, constructed, and implemented these models of care for themselves because of the stigma typically around them that nobody else was attending to it, the way that those individuals and their families felt that they needed to. And so the fact that they're a good fit makes total sense because they were made by the people who suffered and found a way to be able to help them to sustain remission over time.
Right. Yeah. You talk about the barriers to people joining 12-step programs, and there are barriers, and you talk about the language being important. It's maybe a two-part question, but to call someone an alcohol abuser or drug abuser is much different than someone who has a substance use disorder. And so what would you say the barriers are to people joining 12-step programs? And I've got some ideas of my own, but I'm sure you have some thoughts, and it was probably in your paper, and I've heard you talk about it. Why wouldn't somebody want to use something that's free, effective as a solution to their addiction?
Well, I think part of it is finding the right fit, finding the right fit for each person. Sometimes, what we find typically is people are good fits for 12-step programs who want to stop. You have to want to stop their behavior or the alcohol or the drug use, etc. Because there are programs for people who want to quit, not for people who want to cut down or are thinking about it. So if you want to quit, they're a good fit. That's one barrier. Would be that if you don't want to quit, that may not be the best fit. Um, the the other thing that comes up quite frequently is the spiritual or quasi-religious aspects of the language and concepts used in 12-step, which of course historically comes from the Oxford group originally before Alcoholics Anonymous, and made its way into AA and was adapted and incorporated into the 12-step process. So that can be for some people a barrier. For some people, it's not religious enough. It's not spiritual and religious enough. So they choose other ones, like Celebrate Recovery, for example, which is a 12-step religiously based recovery program, or they'll use other faith-based services. So those are some of the big barriers. Some of the other ones are just the kind of logistical, inconvenience of having to get out of the house and go to a meeting. We'll have to go to meetings. And usually, of course, that's related to how much suffering one has endured. Typically, we find that people who have suffered greatly with severe problems, then they tend to be very motivated to get help and to sustain that help because the consequences of not doing that are severe enough that they sustain these involvement over time.
Right.
One course community now, this has been a silver lining of COVID, hasn't it? It's kind of opened all of our eyes to the utility from a clinical and public health perspective of online resources that people can go to online meetings now and gain access to clinicians as well in areas many miles from their own homes so that they can access services, including 12-step and other mutual help. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Zoom has been, I didn't know what Zoom meant in March of 2020, but with COVID has spurred the how ubiquitous, what we're doing right now is, and getting online and you can go to a meeting without leaving your house, But yeah, Alcoholics Anonymous, the word anonymous in there is, important because you may or may not want to have others know that you're working a 12-step program for alcohol addiction. And so, there is a stigma, discrimination. There's not a complete understanding of what 12-step programs do for people. And the spirituality part does sometimes keep people away from 12-step programs, but there are other programs, as you mentioned, that Smart Recovery, for example, I don't believe is 12-step. There's something called Life Ring. So there are many 12-step programs out there. And, the Alcoholics Anonymous in the literature, it says, it talks about agnostics, and you don't have to even believe in God to work the steps. So there's a lack of understanding there, but I think the big message from your work is that yes, it works, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think historically, when you look at the history of AA, I think the surprise was that it tended to work for religious people too. I mean, it was not intended for religion. In fact, it was intended for agnostics, and of course the two co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous were both agnostics. When they founded AA, they were not religious people or believers, but rather agnostic, and so they kind of came to understand the utility and value of incorporating these spiritual aspects as one dimension. Of course, there are many therapeutic aspects to 12-step groups, and the fellowship and the program are powerful mobilizers of therapeutic change. And this is what we find through helping people shift their social network, build coping skills for sobriety and quality of life. And that's what happens. That's what is exchanged in these meetings, as well as the friendships and the social bonds that form, of course.
Right. And I've heard in 12-step recovery rooms that one of the 3 L's will bring you in: your liver, your lover, or the law. And that is often true. You've reached a point, whether it's a bottom or so many negative consequences of your substance use disorder, that you're ready to do something about it. And a lot of times that is treatment, like you say, acute care. Esther Helga Goodmans-Dotier, the owner of this podcast, believes strongly in going to food addiction treatment programs. And then for sustained recovery, she supports 12-step programs. So all of that is important to really embracing recovery and being ready, like you say. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. I want to move to what this podcast is about, which is food addiction, the problem and the solution. I want to set you up for this to talk about food addiction. I know you don't specialize in that, but I've heard you speak about it on other podcasts. We hosted Dr. Robert Lustig on the podcast. In his book, Metabolical, he says, sugar is comprised of 2 molecules, glucose and fructose. Fructose is metabolized in the liver exactly the same way as alcohol, and sugar and alcohol are chemically similar. And it goes on to say sugar triggers the same neurochemistry and neural pathways as cocaine and alcohol, which release dopamine in our brains and gives us feeling of comfort and joy. And this is where the addiction starts. So we know that, of course, alcohol is addictive, but we know, at least I know, I think you may share this, that ultra-processed foods, many of which contain sugar, like high fructose corn syrup, it's cheap for manufacturers and found in many foods and is sugar. So talk about, want to make sure that, make sure you agree that sugar and highly processed foods can be addictive as well.
Yeah, I think, of course, I think anything that has the potential to stimulate that reward pathway in the brain. Of course, food does that naturally. It's one, again, as you pointed out, toxicity is in the dose, as they say. When you get more concentrated forms of any rewarding or reinforcing substance, when you start to condense it, distill it in the case of alcohol, of course, condense it in the form of cocaine, more refined cocaine from the coca leaf, etc. When you condense it, you increase the potency of it, as has been done with foods, then you increase the rewarding value. And if you make it available and you lower the price, it becomes more accessible. So that accessibility, availability, and cultural sanction, it's supported culturally, from, McDonald's to all the other Krispy Kreme. I mean, these are all culturally sanctioned as good businesses. And people like them for reason they are designed for people to like them, of course, to make them very appetizing. And this cultural shift, I mean, if you look over the last 50 years, what's happened with the growth of the ultra-processed foods, it's made them more seductive to the human brain and more pleasing to the human brain. And the low cost has enabled more people to access them. And this has increased these rates of kind of compulsive drug use and food addiction, as you say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Dr. Lustig and I, on the episode we talked about how my great-grandparents had a farm, and they would slaughter cows and chickens to eat. They had a garden, and nothing was processed. And our culture has shifted into 80% of the foods in the grocery are ultra processed, and so what happened to me is I used food to get sober, and then I had to address the food. And just like alcohol, when I ate something that was sweet, it would start the dopamine response, and then I would begin craving it, and I would want more and more, and I needed more and more to get the same effect, and then the addiction starts. That's really what it was all about, just simply put, for me, and I know others. So I want to set you up for this question. In food addiction, there are many food addiction recovery programs. Many of them are 12-step. One is known as Overeaters Anonymous, which was founded on the Alcoholics Anonymous model. and its steps and tradition, literature, model Alcoholics Anonymous, but it deals with food, and it's very similar in terms of compulsive overeating. We know that some people have issues with food, and some people work 12-step programs. Some are morbidly obese. Some have the neurochemistry dopamine response. Some people have addictive food behaviors. Some are very overweight. Some only have 20 pounds to lose. Some are underweight. So we know that 12-step recovery works not only in alcohol addiction, but in OA, Overeaters Anonymous, and other food addiction 12-step recovery programs. Would you agree?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we don't have the kind of strength of the systematic empirical data that we have for AA on other groups. But, I think there are different levels. The way to think about this is there are different levels of evidence. One level of evidence is, do people use something? Are they using something? In this case, OA or another. Do they go back and do they report anecdotally successful outcomes? So that is one level of evidence, not the most rigorous, but it's certainly one that can get attention. If it's sustainable, these models are sustainable, been around for a long time, and they've expanded, not just nationally, but internationally. This is one hallmark of evidence, which then later down the road, you get people like me will come along and say, well, let's evaluate it more rigorously and look to see under which strong empirical scientific conditions, we can produce effects or comparative benefits. And that's what's been done with AA, of course. But there's no doubt that people, and again, it's not for everybody. This is the thing to remember. It's not a universal panacea, anything. It always is going to be some people who respond to certain approaches. Other people will respond to other approaches. So it's important that we have a variety of different options available that people can choose from. That will be a good help. And, OA, like you mentioned, and other 12-step food addiction programs are free and accessible and available. So that's good news. It's finding one that's your speed, that's a good fit, that's your flavor, that you can engage with. Because it's more important to engage with something than nothing. So finding something that's a good fit for you personally will be the way to go.
Yeah, well said. You've done some work on, does 12-step recovery, Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, which have been a public crisis, does it save dollars to our country, the U.S. And I want to relate a couple of statistics that I believe I got from Dr. Lustig. Metabolic syndrome is characterized by either or all of high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, high blood sugar, unhealthy cholesterol, abdominal fat. 93% of the U.S. population, 93% is believed to be metabolically ill. The U.S. obesity epidemic is climbing, and by the year 2030, 6 years from now, it's estimated that 60% of the population will be considered obese, not overweight, but obese. And this is contributing to our country's healthcare costs in a big way. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, well, if you look in the Western world, across middle and high income countries, what are the five major contributors to most of disease and disability is diet, sedentariness, alcohol, drugs, and nicotine. So, they're the big ticket items. We're not dying from infectious diseases these days. Typically, you get a very rare pandemic, which happened with COVID. But for the most part, people do not die in the Western world in developed countries from these things. It's diet, exercise, lack of exercise, so sedentariness, and then alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. So these are the big contributors to most of the disease that we see. As you mentioned, Susan, the diabetes, the hypertension, the heart disease, all of these things are modifiable, preventable for the most part from our behaviors. So yeah, diet is definitely a major contributor, again, through cheaper, more accessible, available, high-density caloric foods.
Yeah, the interesting thing you're talking about are those four things: diet, sedentariness, exercise, alcohol, and nicotine. But that's not what our doctors are telling us when we go in. Yeah, they say eat less, exercise more, but here's some pills in the meantime until you do that. So the system is broken, I would say. That's preventative care, and that's what Dr. Lustig talks about. Is eat right, exercise, don't drink, and don't smoke, and your life expectancy is going to be a lot longer, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, for sure. Right. I mean, part of the problem we have in the United States is that there is no national health care. So that we're not paying for the end result. In other countries, in every other industrialized country, of course, I don't want to get political here, but
Yeah.
In every other industrialized country, I feel like I'm channeling Bernie.
Is he running?
I don't know. I don't think so.
I don't think so.
He's sitting more these days, I think. But he's rather than running. But it makes a lot of sense to me when he says this, which is true. The other industrialized countries have a natural incentive to, at a population level, to prevent disease because they're going to pay for it otherwise. They're going to pay for the end. Well, in the United States, because we do not have any kind of healthcare system other than the Veterans Administration, we don't really care too much about the prevention pieces because we're happy to pick up the tab on the other end once people have developed the diseases. And we're happy to treat the diseases at a much more expensive level through the healthcare system than we do because nobody's forced to think about preventative care very much. Now, we are kind of slowly meandering in that direction, but it's a backwards approach, isn't it? And sensible, non-logical, non-rational approach to, the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, but we're into paying for the pound of cure all the time.
Right, and the pharmaceutical companies are complicit. The medical community takes, I've heard that they take one nutrition class, but it's really not a preventative approach to, healthcare. It's responding to your health problem with pills and medication. So the concept of treating addiction like a chronic illness you've talked about and not blaming the addict is an important one, that addicts are addicts because they have whatever brain response and it's an illness, and don't blame the addict. But that's not what our country has done. Talk about the U.S., how the U.S. handles addiction with the war on drugs, and they treat it like a supply problem, not a demand problem. If you get to the demand problem and the individual and helping that individual that wants to get clean, talk about that.
Yeah, well, again, a part of this has been the kind of misunderstanding by the general public and by extension, politicians, people who are not trained to understand exactly what we've learned in the last 50 years of research into these disorders, courtesy of the National Institutes of Health, largely in the United States. We've learned a lot about the genetic contribution, the susceptibility. They're not genetically determined, but they're certainly genetically influenced. Some people are more vulnerable to addiction than others right out of the gate. Some people have developmental exposure early on in their life, which can have what we call an epigenetic effect. In other words, it can turn on genes that would not be turned on where they're not exposed early on in their lives, or experience other kinds of traumatic events and stressors that can turn on certain genes and make people more susceptible. Now, some of us are protected. Some of us are protected genetically from the onset of these disorders through no, saintliness, but rather just by virtue of our DNA. And what we do know, another thing we've learned in terms of the impact in the brain neurocircuitry, and this is how we clearly understand addiction today, is that the brain changes as a function of this chronic exposure to these high concentrated foods or alcohol or other drugs that actually change the neurocircuitry in the brain as the brain tries to accommodate and adapt to these abnormally high levels of reward and reinforcement produced by these dense nutrients, as you pointed out, in terms of sugar, high fructose, corn syrup, etc., and high density caloric foods and high fat foods, which are very rewarding and appetizing, and particularly among genetically vulnerable individuals, can lead to addiction. And it does change the brain. It changes the brain's neurocircuitry, and it changes the brain structure over time as well. And what we see now in functional neuro imaging as well as structural imaging, we can see how the brain has changed structurally and functionally as a result of chronic exposure. So we know it is a medical abnormality, in other words, in the brain that occurs. And this is why we see these high rates of premature mortality for people who have these disorders, because of this medical malfunction in the brain. Mother Nature did not intend these human organisms to be dying 30 years earlier than Mother Nature intended. There was something that's gone awry as a function of this exposure, coupled with this susceptibility, as I mentioned, to produce the syndrome. And I think a new understanding and clarity around that has helped to reduce stigma. It's not gone away, of course. There's still lots of stigma, or different types of stigma. Stigma is not one thing, but it's multidimensional. So it's important that we gain an understanding of the causes and controllability of these disorders, which feed into stigma, which we've done. But we've got a long way to go in terms of helping people understand more about susceptibility and responsibility. So,
the genetic component, I've heard you speak about this. If you have parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts that have been addicts, drug, alcohol, food, behavior addictions, if they have the addict brain, as Dr. Paul Early says, we hosted him, that you're more inclined to be an addict yourself. Or if you have trauma in your childhood, say sexual abuse, something that was very traumatic, you will have an inclination toward addiction. And if you have both, things aren't looking good as far as becoming addicted. So if you have no genetic link to addiction in your family genetically, and you have a wonderful childhood, the chances of you being an addict are much less. Is that fair to say?
Sure, that is fair to say. That's what we.
That was not my case. That was not my experience. But it would have been nice.
Again, these are all relative risks, so they will increase the risk, and some of them substantially. And again, it doesn't mean you are destined. So this is the other thing to remember. If you do have a family history of alcohol-related drug addiction in your family, or other mental health problems, it does not mean for sure that you will get them, that you will manifest them. You are at high risk, but there's things that can be done early on to prevent onset. So it's not destiny, but rather increased probability. And conversely, on the flip side, if you don't have those risks, you can get it in other ways. They do increase the risk, but there are different pathways into addiction and health problems related to these substances.
Yeah, there is a solution. We know that. But I remember in the 80s when Ronald Reagan was president of our country, and Nancy Reagan had a campaign, just say no. Just say no to drugs. If it was that easy, a lot of us would have gotten sober and abstinent from food a lot sooner. But this country treats it like, the Mexican cartel bringing drugs in. That's the problem. And as long as there's a demand, there will be a supply. So we know it's hard to recover from addiction, alcohol, drugs, food, to get clean and stay clean. And you've done some research on the 1 year mark, the 5 year mark. And the goal is to achieve, as you say, fully sustained remission from the substance. Many addicts, alcoholics, and food try repeatedly to stop and can't, despite negative consequences. I dieted for 43 years. I drank for a long time. I'm clean today. So discuss how you give three things where you say the addict has to decide to change, take action around the change, and then maintain that sobriety by not abusing the substance long-term and avoiding relapse. And that's, I would say, 12-step programs for sure. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think, another thing that we have learned in 50 years of research focusing on these areas is the kind of what we think about as a chronic illness. In other words, it can take a long time. People can suffer for a long time with these illnesses. The good news is that most people eventually will get into remission if they don't die first. Now, I'm not discounting the horrible, preventable, unnecessary, tragic deaths that we see every year. But most people, 75%, who meet lifetime criteria for these disorders will achieve remission. But it can take many years, as you allude to get there. For example, what we know from our clinical studies is that it can take about 8 years and 4 to 5 recovery attempts through treatment or other mutual help groups to achieve that first year of remission, that 1 year kind of clean and sober, if you will. Takes about 8 years to get to that point of being able to get to that first year of remission and about 4 to 5 treatment episodes. But what's also noteworthy is that even when people achieve that first year of full sustained remission, which in and of itself is a big achievement, it takes another 5 years before the risk of meeting criteria for the disorder in the following year drops below 15%. Why 15%? Because that's the annual risk in the general population for meeting one of the criteria for one of these disorders. So it'll be no more likely than anybody else in the general population of meeting criteria for one of these disorders in the following year if you've already had it. Takes an additional 5 years. So risk remains elevated for those first 5 years as the central nervous system is recalibrating and Mother Nature is able to do her work without the toxin on board, without the poison on board. She can start to repair, recalibrate. The person also needs to shape their environment. They create an environment and a lifestyle that's conducive and supportive to long-term change. This is key to sustaining change over time, is setting up your environment to make it easier for you to sustain it. And this is where groups and social network systems that are so prevalent in 12-step communities and other communities of recovery can play a vital scaffolding and supportive role that can provide that scaffolding and access to the building materials that people need.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I mean, part of it is changing your habits and behaviors. I couldn't sit at my favorite bar and have a meal because I was probably going to want a martini. So I had to change my habits around how I drank before. I'm sure you saw that. In eating, I don't go through drive-thrus anymore. I don't stop at gas station, convenience stores and get food. So, but you said 15%. So is that the statistic around the general population who are addicts? Is that the number?
Well, that's the number, the percentage that we'll meet in any given year for an alcohol or drug disorder.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, the shortcuts to recovering from food addiction, of course, we see people getting, they say they're 350 pounds, they get gastric bypass, and that's a serious surgery, and some people become alcoholics because they're still addicts and they're ingesting alcohol after the gastric bypass. Ozempic is the big drug right now. But we know, and you've proven it in your study, that 12-step recovery works. And what would do you have any stats on what worked best in terms of the 12-step recovery? Alcoholics Anonymous, was it meetings? Was it working the steps? Was it literature, the fellowship? Any of those or all of them?
Yeah, there's been some, there's not been enough study to look at kind of the active ingredients in detail, to look at kind of what makes the difference within 12-step organizations. Is it having a sponsor? Is it the literature? Is it prayer and meditation? Is it walking the steps, as you allude to? What we have found, and again, this is based on limited research, I would say, a lot more to do here, but the three things that we know make an additive difference. Number one is meeting attendance. So going to 3 or more meetings per week in the first 3 to 6 months is associated with complete abstinence. Another thing which increases abstinence success and remission success is having a sponsor. Another, in addition to those two, a separate, independent, additive component is sharing at meetings. So just saying something at a meeting, being a participant, as it were, verbally in meetings, is associated with an additional benefit. So those three things, you do those three things, you're going to have an additive effect. It reminds me of one of my former supervisors in San Diego, where I did a little more training with the VA hospital there. When we were sitting in group with the veterans, he was like, "Come on, guys, you need to talk. This is talk therapy, and if you don't talk, there's no therapy." He was kind of trying to get them to loosen up a little bit. But his point is a good one, and it seems to transfer here that speaking in 12-step meetings is good for you.
Yes.
Just like in therapies in general. When you talk, you are expressing something, you're getting something out, and also you're letting people know who you are. So it makes it easier for them to approach you.
Yeah.
So you can break the ice that way. Yeah.
Yeah, I've done all of that. I have taken journals too. I have many stacks of journals where I wrote down what people said, and I've gone back to them. 10 years ago, I go back to them and look at what people said, and they're still relevant today. What do you think, before we go into the next subject, what do you think the keys are to destigmatizing 12-step recovery in the medical community, among our society? What do you think the keys are?
Well, I think partly knowledge. So knowledge of the science that will help, but it won't completely eradicate it. And I think with other stigma and prejudice, it was is this social contact intervention. So which has been shown to work in all kinds of stigma and discrimination work and prejudice work. So in other words, having people from 12-step communities go speak to, educate clinicians face to face if you can, do in-services so that clinicians and medical practitioners get to understand at a really human level the nature and shape, because people hold all kinds of weird ideas about things they're prejudiced against, of course.
Right.
And so those prejudices can be perpetuated without exposure. When you're exposed to the phenomenon against which you're prejudiced, of course, those beliefs can get dismantled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's important for addicts not to identify out. Like, I'm not like those people. I'm not religious. I'm not a bum under a bridge, with a bottle in his hand. And that's what I thought 12-step recovery was. That these were bottom level, just losers in our society. But we know that that's not the case. That they work. I want to move on to a subject involving the DSM and the ICD, which I'll define for the listeners. DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Substance Use Disorder, which is the manual of the American Psychological Association, DSM, for substance use disorders. Alcohol and drugs are in there, of course. Eating disorders such as anorexia and bulimia are in there as psychological disorders, but food addiction is not. And there's a movement afoot to make sure that food addiction gets in the DSM as a substance use disorder. The DSM has 11 characteristics which qualify as a substance use disorder. Among them are tolerance, withdrawal, overuse, repeated attempts to quit. So you held a leadership position at the American Psychological Association. Do you think this might happen, and should it happen?
Well, I think the question is, if it's a public health issue, the question would be, for me, does it have clinical and public health utility to map it onto? Does it map onto conceptually these phenomena that we see in general addiction, and does it have utility to superimpose that structure on this and put it in the DSM, diagnose it, treat it? Does it have utility? I think the answer with utility would be yes. I think the way that it could be conceptualized, I think right now it's being proposed as food addiction, but mapping onto the substance use disorder criteria, right?
Yes, it's actually I'm going to go on to talk about the conference, but ultra processed foods is what they're attempting to place in the ICD, and I'll talk about that. But I would love you to see you do a study on this. I'm sure others would too. It'd be a great study. I believe the next step here I've heard will be research. So it may not get in, but more research needs to be done.
Yeah, I think more research is needed, as they say. Yeah. That's how I like to end my papers.
Yeah, there's one waiting for you. You might be asked to do this.
I've never once ended a paper where I said no more research is needed. We're done.
I understand. I understand.
But it's interesting with the food, food addiction. I think, and again, part of it is the nomenclature and the terminology that relates to these phenomena. They're shied away in the DSM, as you know, for substance use disorder to not include addiction. They didn't use that term. And I think because of the spectrum of alcohol and drug impairment and involvement, there's a huge, wide spectrum. For example, if you've got, just 2 or 3 symptoms of a substance use disorder, you're not addicted.
Yeah, it has to be a majority, like 8 of the 11, I think, something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So, it's more like harmful, hazardous use that can cause problems, but people often have some control, some ability to regulate the impulse to use, despite harmful at the lower end. But at the high end, what we call addiction, then people have this impaired control despite harmful consequences. Classically, what we think of as addiction.
Mm-hmm.
So I would advocate for, in terms of this construct and ICD and DSM adopting it, would be to change it, because change the name of it, not talk about food addiction, but something like a food use disorder or food or high processed food disorder, or something like that, in the same way as done in substance use disorder. Because if with the addiction terminology, we tend to think of it as our classic loss of control. Then we know that, yes, that's true for some people, but there is a spectrum. There's a broad spectrum of impairment, such that people may become overweight, they gain weight because the rewarding aspect, but they're not addicted in the classic sense. They are finding the high processed foods rewarding. They're getting just the same as they do for other substances. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a better way to frame it, rather than call it a food addiction, but rather call it, so even though some people won't become addicted, of course, and meet the classic addiction syndrome, that you have that broader spectrum and describe it as maybe a food use disorder or some better term that captures more spectrum of involvement and impairment related to food.
Yeah. Well, if it's included in the DSM, if food addiction is included, and if that happens, then treatment centers will be paid for by insurance companies. That's a big change that will happen. I know that I was addicted to sugar and ultra-processed foods. I couldn't stop once I started, and the cravings and the whole thing, just like alcohol. So I hope it goes in there. I think the food industry is lobbying heavily. They know we're addicted. Many of us are addicted to the foods. They're powerful. The pharmaceutical industry is powerful. So it's an uphill battle, but I hope it happens. I'll lead into the conference coming up next Friday, 1 week from today, May 17th of this year, 2024. The International Food Addiction Consensus Conference will happen, a one-day event. I know you're familiar with it. Food addiction experts will gather, several people who we've hosted on the podcast, Dr. Robert Lustig, Dr. Nicole Avina, and Dr. Vera Tarman. The purpose of this conference is to build awareness and reach a consensus, an agreement, if you will, among experts about food addiction, ultra-processed foods, as a substance use disorder by the ICD. And I'm going to define the ICD, which is the International Classification of Diseases, which provides common language via coding that allows health professionals to share standardized information across the world. The ICD is a globally used diagnostic tool for health management and clinical purposes, which is managed by the World Health Organization, WHO, and the main aim is to compare statistics on causes of mortality and morbidity between world regions over time. The ICD provides a common vocabulary for recording, reporting, and monitoring health problems. And I didn't make this up. I found this online. So I think I'm in the right. I think it's a proper definition. So the idea of the conference here is for experts to gather, reach a consensus, and present this to be placed as a substance use disorder, that is ultra processed foods, in the ICD, so the WHO will recognize it. It's an important event. I just want to hear what your thoughts are about it.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in this area, but again, what I would say is that conceptually, it makes a lot of sense. I think it warrants, as you alluded to, Susan, it warrants more research to understand what is the nature, what's the phenomenon of the expression of this impaired ability to regulate the intake of these ultra processed foods. Is it the same as addiction to other? I think it certainly fits. It makes total sense to me, given what we know about the reward pathway, how these foods, high processed foods, high density caloric foods, can stimulate the reward pathway in abnormal ways.
Yes.
In ways that are much more potent, immediate, potent, and predictable than historically was the case. And so it's, again, this distillation, if you will, the distillation of foods to make them high potency, high reward, can create, particularly among susceptible individuals, a syndrome which looks like classic addiction to any other type of substance.
Yeah. I think the missing piece of this conference is treatment and clinical experts there to say, yes, we have this problem. How do we treat it? Where is the treatment? Like you say, acute treatment, but then 12-step recovery, which Esther and I both know works and works. So we know that recovery is possible with or without treatment. I didn't go to a treatment place. I used 12-step recovery programs to recover from alcohol and food. So they work. You have the study to prove it, right?
Yeah, this is what we've seen. Again, the last 50 years has produced this body of knowledge showing us. It makes a lot of sense. I think it confirms and underscores and validates the experience of people like yourself, Susan, and the millions of others who utilize and benefit from these entities out in the world. We've just shown that from a scientific standpoint. Shown that to be true empirically as well. It's good news. This is why I describe, 12-step organizations and similar organizations as the closest thing public health has to a free lunch, because of their ability to provide this free, flexible access to ongoing support structures that are these entities that can sustain remission over time. And this is what we need. For a chronic illness, you need some kind of chronic solution.
Yes.
That, as I mentioned, that 5-year time frame is very important. There's that instability that persists over that first 5 years after people have that first year of recovery, that first year of remission. It persists for a long time. So people are still susceptible in those early years of recovery. And this is where the stabilizers of peers with lived experience in a program of action that can help regulate emotion.
Mm-hmm.
There's an emotion regulation ability of these programs, and the stabilizing force of the peers in the programs can help people to sustain adaptive changes over time. That's good news.
Yeah. And what we learn in 12-step recovery is that we don't need a substance to cope with life, to cope with relationships, to deal with stress. We use the program of recovery, and you have to get in there and understand how it works to really figure that out. But it's been transformative to me. So this has been great, Dr. Kelly. I have one more question for you, and we'll kind of close out. I think this has been a great discussion. I know it'll be helpful to our listeners. Let's say the last question is someone out there who, and this was probably me 15 years ago, who was using alcohol too much abusively, and I weighed over 200 pounds. I was working too hard. That was a behavior addiction. And I didn't know how to get out. I didn't know how to change. I knew I needed to change. What would you say to someone who is 100 pounds overweight, let's say, and alcohol addicted, and maybe gambling or working too hard or something? What would you say in terms of hope? Where would they go?
Well, I think I would ideally speak to a knowledgeable, somebody who's trained and experienced in dealing with these types of problems, of course, because you want people who can understand, who can help you, support you, direct you, either provide it themselves or direct you to a place where you can get the help that you need. The good news is that the sooner that you do it, the sooner that you pick up the phone, make that call, do something different to seek help. If you've been spinning your wheels around and around again, digging that hole deeper, the sooner you do it, the easier it will be actually for you to get into remission, into recovery, even though it doesn't seem like it right now. But if you can access help, you can pull you out of that hole and get you on a new journey of recovery. And it's, like I said, 75% of people get into remission, into recovery, who have these disorders, and you can get there a lot sooner if you can access help. So some kind of help, some kind of knowledgeable person can help you do that. But most people on the severe end of the spectrum, as you described, who have the density of problems, Susan, that you described, they probably need a little bit more extra help to pull them out of that ditch.
Mm-hmm. Maybe psychotherapy or medication,
and peer support. All of those things I would say I would recommend to help them. Yeah. So again, it's hard, very difficult, and a lot of times it's other people intervening earlier. It's other people making that call for them. That's fine. Doesn't matter. Whatever way you get access to help, but get that. You got to get out of that ditch first. Whether that's you doing it or asking somebody to help you to do it, doesn't matter. The important thing is get out of the ditch and then get on the road of life. Yeah.
And for me, I had to say, I had to get out of denial that 43 years of dieting, all those years of drinking, that it was that bad. I had to get out of denial of it, of how it was having negative consequences in my life. And I realized I could not do it on my own. So as we know, you have to finally surrender to it, that alcohol and food beat me in a fair fight. And so I had to listen to people. I had to do what they say, which is not easy for me to do. But we are powerless over these substances often as addicts. Thank you for joining me. This has been great. I think Esther's going to love it. She really appreciates your participation, Dr. Kelly. And we'll put the links in the notes. And thank you for all of your work. And I hope this consensus group reaches out to you to do some research for them.
My pleasure being here, Susan. Thanks for having me. Good talking to you.
This is the Food Addiction Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the podcast and learned more about food addiction. We hope you will rate and write a review on this episode and share it with others. If you or someone you know is suffering from the disease of food addiction, there is a solution. The various food addiction recovery programs available are listed on the website, infactschool.com. Or if you would like to know more about how to get certified in treating food addiction, the InFact School is accepting applications now for its next training. On the website, you will find information about getting trained and certified to treat food addiction. Go to infactschool.com.